Hi, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. So it's good to see such still shiny faces out here. You guys are still with us. We appreciate it. Hi, I'm Michael Steele. I am the former chairman of the Republican National Committee. Thank you very much. Served in that capacity from 2009 to 2011. In which Republican Party gained the most seats in the House of Representatives since 1928. We also won an immense number of legislative races, again, the largest since the 1920s. And also I served as lieutenant governor of the great state of Maryland from 2003 to 2007. And in both the capacities as national chairman and the lieutenant governorship, I served as the first African-American elected to both of those positions, first African-American elected statewide in the state of Maryland, the first Republican lieutenant governor in the 370-year history of the state of Maryland. So I'm old. It's been around a long time. Served as a lieutenant governor of Maryland also, but certainly as county chairman, state chairman, national chairman, elected officials. So I have some sense of the stress tests that our political system often goes through. This conversation that we're about to have speaks to the institutions that are under enormous scrutiny today, largely off of matters regarding matters that we discussed in the last panel: social media, the encouragement and the engagement of a younger audience of voters and how they're driving some of those conversations, and the impact that they have on institutions. To help us get into the conversation, we have an enormously talented panel of folks whom I will share a bit about and then give you a broad view of what we're going to talk about. And then we're just going to jump right up on it, right? We're just going to do it. So to my left, Sara Craig Gongol, who is a veteran. Where's Sara down there? There she is. There's Sara, veteran Republican strategist who currently serves as executive director of the Republican Governors Association. You will hear it referred to as the RGA as well in this conversation. She is part of the leadership of directing the party's committee's political and policy operations through the 2026 cycle. So her work took on a whole new level of urgency literally the Wednesday after this last election. So her goal now is to get Republican governors elected across the country. And she also serves as chief of staff and general consultant to Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds. In those roles, she helped Reynolds win a hard-fought election in 2018 and secure a commanding re-election victory in 2022. So she brings that level of experience. We also have with us, very happy to say, Joe Pounder. He's the founder and CEO of Bullpen Strategy Group. He is, which offers insight-driven public affairs and strategic advisory firm with offices in DC, Dallas, and London, serving clients across diverse industries in the U.S. and abroad. Before founding BSG, Joe launched several successful communications and research organizations and held senior roles in American politics, including as a senior advisor to Secretary of State Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign, communications director in Mr. Rubio's Senate office, and deputy campaign manager for his 2010 Senate race. Pounder also served as research director and deputy communications director at the Republican National Committee. Fortunately for him, after I was there, so he didn't have to deal with my crazy when I was RNC chairman. During the 2012 cycle, and previously worked with House Republican Whip, my old buddy Eric Cantor, along with the presidential campaigns of Senators McCain and Mitt Romney. And so he has a well-founded communications background as well. JoDee Winterhof, veteran political strategist and senior vice president for federal and state affairs at the Human Rights Campaign. In her role, she leads HRC's legislative field and legal teams and manages the organization's political action committees and electoral engagement efforts. Ms. Winterhof has spent over 20 years navigating the intersection of politics, campaigns, messaging, and public policy, earning a reputation as a skilled strategist and advocate. And I know that firsthand and watched her do her magic, which will lend a lot to this conversation. And then we have Meghan. So I say it that way because Meghan is like, don't come after me. Meghan Meehan-Draper is a veteran Democratic strategist and executive director of the Democratic Governors Association, the DGA, overseeing fundraising, political strategy, and candidate support for governors nationwide. Since joining the DGA in 2015, she has been instrumental in driving record fundraising, building long-term donor networks, and creating initiatives such as the Unrig the Map campaign to elect Democratic governors in states with redistricting authority, and the Women Governors Fund, which has helped elect multiple Democratic women governors. So both of those fronts have been extremely important in the last few cycles, and probably will play even more important roles in this cycle, as we've already begun to see the sort of the working of the maps before the next census cycle begins. Ms. Meehan-Draper served previously as National Finance Director and Major Donor Director, raising over $270 million for gubernatorial campaigns during the 21 and 22 cycles. So sister can raise some cash. As a former chairman, I like that.
It's our competitor, I do not.
So here's the backdrop so that we can get a sense of where we want to go with our conversation real quick. You've all seen over the last number of years the stress testing of our institutional systems, both here in the UK and especially in the United States, particularly in the United States, which has been a sort of go along to get along system, where even in the rife between Republicans and Democrats, there's a general thread of, okay, we're not going to break things. We're not going to disrupt things. We're just all going to play nice, but I'm going to get my way. Right? And that's the stress and the test is how do you get your way on the things you want without breaking things? That is not how things work necessarily today. We have a lot of the foundational assumptions about the institutions, both federal and state, which is going to be important to hear from our state leadership here for the DGA, the Democratic Governors Association, and the RGA, the Republican Governors Association, how our state officials are dealing with this disruption of federal institutions, and whether that has some downstream pressure on their statewide institutions in providing the services that they need. Also layered into this is the disruption judicially with our court system, as well as constitutionally. The boundaries that are being stress tested there by the current administration. So we want to get into both the political and civil society institutions and how they're meeting this current moment. And that's going to really drive our conversation. So I want to go down and get a top line view of how you see these systems being stress tested. And so we'll start with Andrew Jackson. And whether or not Mr. Andrew Jackson, if you're nasty, understands exactly what, no, so I thought I figured that keep the Andrew Jackson thing going because you guys are, so into him in the first panel.
No,
Well,
exactly. The nuns. Don't worry. I'll
Mr.
get
George
it, Joe.
Francis, that's all comes to mind, and that was a scary experience. But no, seriously, how do you see the institutions holding up right now, given the pressures that we see coming at both ends from a president like Trump, and as an example, a governor like Newsom, or even other governors out there who are beginning to try to figure out how to work in this new environment. So we'll just go straight down the line, if you don't mind, beginning with you, Megan.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here. Is my mic on? I can't tell. It is? Okay, great. Yeah, it's great to see all these fresh faces who are interested in politics, so thanks for having me. I just think the ultimate symbol of our institutions fraying in the United States right now is our president, who calls himself King Trump. I mean, and while he literally demolishes the White House or attempts to turn it into his own palace, to me, that is kind of says it all. And I think, at least on the Democratic side, I think we have a total ownership federally. And so what's happening is you're having to go look to the states that used to be called the laboratories of democracy, and now I think are the defenders of democracy and defenders of institutions in this country. I think it's forced, Democratic governors, attorneys general, the court system to sort of push back to keep our institutions and some of the norms that we expect in our country together. I think, for example, it's not normal to send National Guards into states where that sitting governor did not ask for them or want them. Even Republican governors, like the governor of Oklahoma, Kevin Stitt, said this is not normal, and if this is happening on the other side, we would reject it. I think it's not normal to have federal agents patrolling communities where they're not asked for or welcome. And so I think you're having to look to state leaders, Republican and Democrat, frankly, who have a lot of power and say to say this isn't normal. Like we have to uphold some of our institutions. So between lawsuits, I think, suing the Trump administration, or, using whatever state laws and powers you have at your discretion, you're seeing a lot of the pushback, I think, coming from state legislators and governors and state attorneys general. So the last couple of things I'll say was that I think government is supposed to play a supporting role in making people's lives better. Like that really is what the purpose of government is. And people don't want to see that support taken away completely. Like they really don't. They expect some amount of support from their government. And I'm not talking about literal benefits, but I mean like clean air, roads to drive on that work, like your institutions around you working, your good public schools. And I think that our election results we had this past week in the United States, where Democrats won governor's races in Virginia, New Jersey, and Democrats won a major ballot initiative in California, was kind of a reminder of that. Where like people are actually rejecting some of this chaos and stripping of support away from you, and instead saying like, we want government to work for us. That's what actually people want. And the last thing I'll say is that we always say at the DGA, good governing is good politics, and you are actually politically rewarded when you make institutions and government work well for people. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, Joe.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I tend to look at it and say, granted, in communications, I live 24-hour news cycles all day, every day. And I think when we deal with questions like this, we have a tendency to focus on the moment. Like, hey, what's happening today? What's the controversy of the moment? How do I win? How do I beat the other side? But I think also we need to kind of step back from that at the same time, because I think what we've seen with the American system is there's always a give and take and a push and pull between the three branches of government, whether they be legislative, executive, or judiciary. We always have presidents trying to get more executive power. We have Congresses that either have strong speakers or don't have strong speakers, judiciaries that are ruling every single day. And we see that playing out, I think, now as well. I tend to take maybe a higher level view on the state of democracy and the state of our institutions, dealing with all present company exempted Gen Z staffers and so forth, who the global pandemic was the worst thing and the biggest controversy that ever happened and life-changing. And then I go back to my career over politics. I'm like, well, I was in high school when 9/11 happened. I was in college when the wars in the Middle East happened. I was working John McCain when the 2008 financial crisis happened. I thought I'd never work again in politics. We had the rise of populism, and then we had a global pandemic. So just reminding about all the things that we've seen over the last 20 years. And I think throughout that, the American system has proven to be quite resilient as we've gone, through the push and pull and so forth. So yes, I think we can focus on this moment and so forth. But I think if we look at the broader scope of history, there is always this push and pull. And you go back even to the 1960s, the 1970s, and so forth, where our system has seen great upheaval from assassinations to then Watergate. We've lived this before, and our system has always proven to be resilient. There may be new power centers that come up to the fore, but ultimately the democracy seems to live this push and pull all the time.
I do agree with Joe in that the democracy has survived lots of tugs and lots of pulls, but I think this is a more extreme pull than we have had in perhaps over 100 years at least. And I think when we talk about institutions, I think we have to kind of divide things up a little more than just like what we've talked about so far, a little bit about the party structure and elections and courts and Congress. I think you have to toss in corporate America and just, educational institutions and other institutions. And it's easier to make a list that gets a little bit long about institutions that have been attacked than ones who have not. And I think that, where that leads me is to look at the nature of the leadership currently. And so, it checks more boxes than I would like it to on the spectrum of being authoritarian. And, I find in terms of being working in the entity that I work in currently and being an advocate for LGBTQ people, we certainly are a community that has been attacked in various ways over time, but certainly right now acutely with the transgender community. We've seen it in the most recent elections and we've seen it otherwise. And so there's kind of a breadth. And I would offer, as we think about some of the comments from earlier and the nuns, and then we understood the nuns, and then we got nuns, but folks drifting away from wanting to be identified with or participating in institutions. And so we have the weakening of some of the institutions, in my opinion, some of the ones I've mentioned, because they're not standing up even for their own workers or their own students and faculty, or right. And so where do we land if that's the case, and then there's already a drift away from those institutions? I think that's only going to become more intense as we see some of these things unfolding. However, on the other side of the coin, when you work for an advocacy organization, we have added over 500,000 people to our roles of being members and supporters in a year because of the last election, because of some of these attacks. So, so there is that. But that's out of fear and worry about rights being protected, about where's the future. So I do think when we think about how this swirl goes in the next, period of time, there are, I always say it's like pendulums, right? They swing. And so this is swinging, and how far is it going to swing? And is it going to swing even further before it comes back? And then, but in terms of like institutions, I think we're in a real moment of crisis. And I think that there are lots of individuals or groups within those institutions who are probably going to be some of the push over the leadership of those institutions making change.
Okay, my turn. So I think to JoDee's point, the pendulum swings. And one of the things that I like the most about America is that we are designed inherently to have a weaker federal system and have states' rights and have very, very strong states' rights. I'm a very passionate advocate for states, and I know Meghan is too, or we wouldn't be working for the people that we work for. Governors, I think, are the future of democracy. They're the future of America. They always have been. This whole idea of pushing back on the federal government is not something that's new from governors and attorney generals. I mean, I remember being part of lawsuits against the Obama administration. We filed many, many lawsuits against the Biden administration. This is nothing new. This is what, the states oftentimes are the ones who are pushing back on the federal government. And so I happen to like that we are a system that's built like this, and that it gives governors an extra level of control and power. It's fun for me to watch Democrats finally coming around to the idea of block grants. And the federal government funds a lot of things in the states and sends a lot of money to the states. Oftentimes that money comes with a ton of strings, a ton of red tape. And now you're seeing a lot of governors, because they don't, want what the strings that are coming with the Trump administration, to say, no, we want a block grant, just give it to us. We know how to spend our money. The healthcare needs in California are different than the healthcare needs in Iowa. So please don't put strings on this money. We want that. And so we can control it for our citizens. We think we can do it in the best type of way. Well, let me tell you, Republicans have been saying that for 100 years. I mean, we believe that each state should be managed in a different way than the federal government, and that the state itself knows better than the rest. The education needs in a state like Iowa, it's a very rural state, is very different than the education needs in inner city Chicago. And so having those individual states' rights, I think, are a very important part of democracy and how we move forward. And we are the kind of the innovation centers. You see a lot of good new ideas coming out of states that then the federal government oftentimes replicates, or states replicate when they see their neighbor doing something.
So I like the way this conversation started, because it really, for me, draws down into a space that I think is particularly important and definitional for these times. We began with this idea of the power of state officials, governors using the laws in their states to move their agendas, attorneys generals in various states taking legal action as necessary to protect the interest of those states. And then we looked, Joe leveled up for us this idea that yes, all of this movement, all of this activity is an indication of the resilience of the American system, how strong it is, how you can stretch it and you can push it and you can reshape it, and it falls back into the framework of the framers. This idea that the rights are there within the states to move as they see fit. And that was where Sara was talking about, the states are the innovators, the states are the creators, the states are the ones that are pressing the envelope. But for me, JoDee put her finger on the thing that makes all of that work. And it makes all of it work at a very core level. That in the estimation of a lot of folks right now at the federal level is missing, and that is leadership. The nature of leaders is a significant part of the ingredients necessary for all those other pieces that you put on the table for them to work. In order for that laboratory to be an effective laboratory, you need the leaders, whether it's the governors, the state legislature, the members of Congress from that state, the U.S. senators from that state, to all be aligned on the same page. So how do you explain, or how do we deal with the reality that right now there is this chasm that exists, that federal leaders are following a different drummer than state leaders? And it doesn't, to be honest with you, matter whether you're from a red state or a blue state, because I could talk about a whole bunch of red states right now who are getting screwed to hell on health care because their leaders are not protecting necessarily their interests. at a core, if nothing else, a verbal level. Just say, I want the healthcare subsidies to be in place. Now we can have do the politics and the policy of how you get there. But even the articulation through your leadership of your fight for your people is very different at the federal level than what you hear at the state level. So I'll put that right there in the middle of the table, and y'all can dance with that if you want. What do you think? Because the leadership for me is an incredible part of it.
I think Meghan would probably agree. I mean, in the states, you have to balance a budget. You have to, they legislate, a lot of legislative sessions happen once a year, and they're not year-round legislative sessions, or they happen every other year. And they're closer to their people. They actually, there's things that they have to accomplish every single day. And so I often tell people, you know, Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, can do more in 1 hour than a United States senator can do in a month. I mean, just the authority and the power that they have. And so they are leading every single day based on the people expect them to get things done. I think that, no offense to my friends in the federal government, I don't think anyone expects them to get a whole lot done anymore because they haven't gotten anything done for a really long time. And so the expectation just isn't there, but it definitely is there for our state leaders. They expect the governor to get something done.
What does that mean?
Sara and I agree on many things, and that's one of them. I mean, I have been at the DGA for a decade, and before that, I did a bunch of campaigns around the country. But after a couple, again, no shade to my federal friends, but after a couple congressional races, I was like, I can't do this anymore. I'm not excited about sending someone to Congress because I'm just not really sure it's going to happen when they get there. And what are the reasons that I'm a Democrat? What are the things I really care about? For example, I care about good public schools. I care about ending the death penalty. I care about, you know, environmental justice. What are the things that drive me forward? All of those things are happening in states with Democratic governors, and that's where I want to focus my work. And so for the last 10 years, I've been sort of cultivating the Democratic ecosystem, the Democratic donor system, to say, if you want strong leaders for our party who actually get things done, who don't just make sure the camera's facing on them for C-SPAN, speak, and then leave the Senate floor, then invest in the states and invest in the pipeline of Democratic governors in our party. And I think you've really seen that, because now when I travel around the country and talk to donors and activists and, you know, allied groups, all of them say to me, a governor should be the president, a governor should be the president, a governor should be the president. They get things done. And both on the Republican side and Democratic side, they can win kind of anywhere. There's a Republican governor of Vermont, which people think of as a very, very blue state. But our chair is from Kansas. We have a Democratic woman governor from Kansas. Our vice chair is from Kentucky. These are people who won their races by saying we have to get things done and deliver for people. And that's just what I was saying before. Good governing is good politics and delivering for people.
Joe, is that part of the resilience to all of this, or?
So I would say, you know, as someone who works with a lot of corporate clients, helping them manage political risk these days, they still have to live with the federal government, and the federal government being there every day. And there is a lot of leadership on a lot of different issues coming out of DC, whether we saw tax policy with the reconciliation bill. There have been a lot of different implications if tax policy was not extended earlier this year. You know, we see it with artificial intelligence. The attitude of the federal government is very important for setting policy when it comes to AI and the framework and the innovation that's going to come. And in many ways, it might be, you know, concerning if we all of a sudden a year from now we have 50 different state policies when it comes to artificial intelligence and so forth. So that's an active, open question. And I think the regulatory framework, our corporate clients live every day with what are the regulations that are coming out of places like Commerce, EPA, and so forth, that have a lot of direct implications on jobs, where you build plants in the United States and so forth. So, you know, it may seem like not a lot happens in DC, but there is a lot of policy that is coming out of these agencies that corporate America has to deal with. At the same time, where I might differentiate it and agree with both RGA and DGA is innovation is probably where you're going to see more of the activity when it comes to these states, because these governors do have a different mandate. They have very tight sessions to get stuff done. So our corporate clients who are looking to push the envelope to create new policy are definitely looking towards the states. And actually at this point, you know, we do a fair amount on the artificial intelligence space. They're now looking towards city councils and county commissions, because where you build the plant is just as important, and whether you get a permit and whatnot. So I think there's a really actually a big recognition that government is playing a big part in their lives and whatnot, whether you say there's leadership or not coming from that. So maybe you have to live with the federal government, you're going to get innovation from the state government, and then you got to monitor and be on top of your local city councils.
But JoDee, it's still leadership for me. I mean, as a former elected official, it mattered whether or not I met the mandate. And so the expectation of people, and we talked about in the last panel, a lot of Americans are pissed right now. They're ticked off beyond measure. And, you know, let's not get it twisted. Democrats had a wonderful Tuesday a week ago. But like a lot of things in politics, that was last Tuesday. Okay. And so the dynamic really boils down to how those newly electeds, governors from New Jersey, Virginia, how propositions like Prop 50 in California, which was to allow for a redistricting of the legislative congressional districts, in California before the required redistricting in 2030. How these things play out for the people boils down to the leaders who are there, somewhat to Joe's point, at the various levels to push those agendas.
I mean, I think that what it feels like is going to happen in a time like this is not just that we need those leaders who are tangibly accomplishing things, working to lower prices, et cetera, but also be a little more inspirational to connect to folks. And I think when you're in a time like that, you don't know for sure where some of that leadership is going to come from. And so, you know, I do think that some of these elections that happen, I don't want to downplay what just happened, because the numbers that flipped in 1 year in those states were pretty extraordinary. And we certainly saw, and this is obviously from a HRC seat, a lot of the anti-transgender attacks didn't work at the end of the day for the reasons that people were voting, right? I'm not saying they're not an effective messaging and make people pause, but at the end of the day, what happened in those elections is those issues were at the very bottom, and they were worried about a lot of the core issues that we've been talking about. And so I do think that, you know, I'm not going to deny my friend Sara on the left and Meghan on the right, which is,
We need to switch that.
whoop, we're on. You know, that works for the audience. It works for the audience. There you go. But, you know, and I think governors do have, like, they do have their checklist and their deadlines, and more often than not, they stick to it. But I think this atmosphere that is being created by undermining norms, by making change in ways that could dismantle multiple institutions, structures. I think norms are almost at the door. So no offense, Meghan, but I think we might even not even be in that discussion. And so how do you both get through that and land on the other side where you have leaders who actually are in that space of getting things done, as opposed to just disrupting and not letting things go forward? Because we've also had that. And some people would say, well, that's kind of Congress. Yeah. And it's the country. We are so polarized. I don't know how many of you ever try this. I try it probably more than I should. I talk to people all the time, wherever I am. And usually it kind of gets around to how things are going in life. I don't dive into the partisan, but, you know, you quickly can have a conversation and understand that what people are dealing with out there. I'm a sandwich generation. I have teenagers and I have parents with health issues in their 80s, but it's not a linear thing. People are living in a vortex or something like that right now, where the pressures and the things coming around them are just like 24/7 for them, and they really don't know how to navigate it. And I think for the younger generation, I do believe, Joe, I've lived through a few more things, and having to hear that people were you were in high school for 9/11. I'm like, oh, Lordy. Okay, well, I wasn't. I was on the Hill when that all happened. But, you know, when you think about what this younger generation and the institutions around them that basically we couldn't figure out as adults how to get COVID kind of under control and get them back into school as fast as we could to have more norm going on in their lives, that maybe some of these institutions that they're like supposed to trust and believe in, maybe they aren't going to believe in them as much or question some of the leadership of this. And so I think there are just lots of currents. And I think, Michael, that we have good leaders at different levels, and they come from, you know, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. But I think that whole visionary leadership, in addition to the I can get shit done leadership, that's where we're going to have to see what transpires in this next while.
Yeah, I think that's largely right. So let's unpack that a little bit more then, because I think when you're talking about get shit done leader, the guy or the gal who's going to sit there and go, okay, I need to get through that door over there, and these are the various legislative obstacles I have to meet sitting in this room here to get my agenda through that door to where the people are. And how that leader does that is an essential element of the success of the institution of governing. Because in everything we're talking about, at the end of the day, we're talking about governing. That's what governors do. That's what presidents do. That's what Congresses and state legislatures do. But when that breaks in some form or fashion, the getting through the room of legislative hurdles and congressional hearings and administrative hassles becomes much more the game than the idea that I got to get this done. As a mayor, I got to make sure the streets are plowed and the stoplights work, right? As a governor, I got to make sure that all the resources that my state needs get to the parts of my state where they're needed. In any institution within government, you see the breakdown of what those costs are. So why do we now suffer the way we do from an incredibly broken sense of leadership that is also broken the institutions? So did the institutions break first, or did the leadership break the institutions? Because I think that's part of what has to get resolved, and it's difficult for those at the state level who are managing a very different set of priorities than you see at the federal level. So as a governor, how do you manage that relationship when you have a federal partner who threatens your city with federal intrusions, who threaten your resources with withholding money, who threaten, your opportunity costs for your citizens by making it more expensive for you to manage? And again, we can point at instances of that in the Biden administration. We can point at instances of that in the Trump administration. The through line is the governor who has to govern through all of that. So how do they do it?
I want to go back to the premise that I think there are stresses on our institutions every day. But I don't think that American democracy is broken. I mean, we sat at this exact conference 2 years ago, and I remember we were talking about Trump being indicted and all the crimes and the insurrection of January 6th and how American democracy is on the brink. And we held an election and he won. And then this past Tuesday, we had another election and Democrats won in 2 Democrat states that they were supposed to win in. And so I don't think that.
They were supposed to win in Virginia?
Oh, yeah. Virginia is a blue state.
I will say every statewide elected is a Republican.
Tell that to the Republican. I was going to say, tell that to the Republican governor who won the state, but okay.
Trump lost the state by 6. He carried the popular vote. He won the election in 2024 in a lot of states, and he lost Virginia by 6 votes. That is not a red state. New Jersey is not a red state. Anyway. But I would say that, elections have consequences. Donald Trump is doing everything. I mean, he campaigned on all of the things that he is doing, and he is now trying to put them into action with or without Congress and having Congress's backing to do it. And if it's legal for him to do it without Congress's backing, he's going to do it. And that's what people want. I will say this, in 2006, nobody wanted George Bush in that election campaigning for them out in the states. I think that I would like Donald Trump to come out and campaign.
Well, that's not true. I asked him to come into Maryland.
Okay.
And he did, as did Dick Cheney, as a sitting Republican in a blue state. So I think I get your point, but I guess the stress test to the system is I don't recall the President of the United States saying that he would take grandmothers and children and put them in the custody of ICE. So I think that breaks for a lot of voters out there, which may explain when you look at the crosstabs in the last election, the loss of Hispanic energy around the Trump agenda. So that's really what I'm trying to get at. When the governing part breaks down for the voters out there, that leader, that I'm going to get shit done leader, which Trump proclaimed himself to be, in many respects, loses a little bit of that energy among voters, and you have an election like you just saw, where they're saying to the administration, time out, this is not getting done what I want done. Now, that sets up what happens in the next cycle, which we're in right now. For those who don't follow American politics, the 2026 cycle began Wednesday at 12 a.m. Last week. And, you're going to see those races unfold. But how do governors and state legislatures, which is really the core of this conversation, for me, at least, I hope for all of you, are going to be the drivers of what that agenda is. Do you see Republican governors in states like Colorado, Utah, et cetera, particularly in Utah, who's already sort of carved out an interesting niche space to have a conversation about what the president is doing? Do you see them doing more of that to sort of create their own, I'm the governor, whether they were going to run for president or not? Let's be clear. This is not about setting up themselves up for presidential politics yet. But in the moment, recognizing that some of these institutions at the federal level just aren't going to work for us. Because the next part of what we're going to go to is the constitutional piece, which I think the states have had to deal with as well. But let's just stay on the administrative side of things for the moment.
I just a couple things, Dad. First, when we did all of our research and focus groups for these governor's races we had in 2025, we were talking to a ton of voters who supported Trump in 2024. Like suburban moms who voted for Trump, Latinos who voted for, across the board, almost all of them said, this is not what I asked for. Almost all of them said yeah, I really am concerned about illegal immigration, but I didn't mean this. I thought he was going to, make my life more affordable, but everything's more expensive. He's traveling internationally and I can't afford my rent. Over and over and over again, that is what we heard. This isn't what I signed up for. And so I think that's why you did see some major trends in 2025 where we made major gains with men, major gains with non-college educated voters, major swing with Latino voters. And I think to your question, Michael, about breaking through all the legislative obstacles and being a get stuff done kind of leader, one of my favorite examples is anyone here from Pennsylvania? I saw a couple of people. Okay, Governor, this is not sexy, but it's a perfect example of this. Governor Shapiro created a first in the country system for permitting reform in Pennsylvania. They used to have a crazy backlog of people who applied for state permits, anything from becoming a hairdresser, a cosmetologist or whatever. And people were not getting answers when they applied for these state permits. And so he created through executive order a law where you have to get an update on your permit application, a yes or no, within 14 days. You can also track the progress of your permit application online through that state agency website to see if it's being reviewed, if it's been accepted, you name it. And if you do not get an answer on your permit, yes or no, your application fee gets refunded by the state. So what this created is, one, a massive increase in people getting their small business permits, their building permits, their licensing permits, you name it. It's held state government employees way more accountable for doing their jobs. And it's created a better citizen experience with government to say, wow, government can actually work for me. After Charlie Kirk was murdered, Governor Shapiro, who's also been a victim of political violence, gave this like big speech about how one of the things we can do to decrease political violence and uphold our institutions is make government work for people. And like permitting reform, like giving someone a permit can actually help lead to like a more peaceful place because it's an example of someone getting what they asked for. And transparency around that. So I think it's just a very good example of like a leader who's leading with vision, but it's also a get stuff done kind of approach.
I might add a little bit of a frame to that too, is like, I think in this rise of populism that we've seen over the last 10 years or so forth, the issue set has become a lot less purely ideological. You know, we used to have conversations in the 2000s about what is the right amount of tax rate and tax policy and so forth. And now it's just much more practical. Am I paying more for something or not? And I think that's a different type of US election than we've dealt with, quite honestly. And that's the biggest development, I think, in US politics over the last 20, 25 years, that now the swing vote will be the populist more voter who's like, did something get done?
Right.
You know, and I think that's where you would point to a Governor Shapiro, I would point to a Governor Kemp who had a very successful legislative session, pushing very significant reforms, very powerful spokesman for conservative positions and principles and whatnot. Like, so I think that's the new mentality. And that might be the swing that we see in elections going forward from 2025 to 2026 to 2028, which actually increases the pressure to govern and put forward policy solutions and whatnot. And I think, you know, if the Trump guys were here right now, they would say, listen, we're doing a lot of what we said we were going to do. We're focusing on taxes. We're focusing on foreign leadership. We're focusing on immigration and so forth. Like, so they would say, that, yes, there's been a lot of leadership going forward. So I think, but that is now the new mandate. I think for the new governors of Virginia and New Jersey, and now the new mayor of New York City, how you deliver free childcare for everyone is going to be a huge question. How you cap utility rates in New Jersey is going to be a huge question. But the promise was made. Can they deliver? And that's what people are now going to vote on going forward.
JoDee, you want to?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that part of this, when you think of being a state official and you do get part of your resources for education and for health from the federal government, not knowing for sure how that's all going to go, or not having confidence as to how that's going to go, or even in this shutdown that we've all been living in, that if a state wanted to put forward some money, oh, but the cards aren't working, like that's a federal or administrative government piece, right? So I think there's going to continue to be stress, because the question that kept coming back to my mind is, how far is Donald Trump willing to go for his agenda? And as far as I know, as far as he would want on a given day, right? And so what level of disruption, that for me goes into a level of cruelty, like we saw around the food piece and with SNAP benefits, of not getting them out to people or blocking other people's ability to get those monies out to people. And so, and even when the court decision came down, it's, you know, it's probably too far down the pipeline. But when you think about that, and I think about what does business want? What do governors in a state want? What do people want? They want a predictability that they can do their life and make their decisions, and that prices aren't going to get so crazy they can't afford them. My home state is Iowa, and so right now the farmers out in Iowa are freaking out. And they're freaking out because they just are finishing harvest. And, you know, some of the tariffs have lessened their ability to sell soybeans, as example, to China. And, you know, there's, you know, some of this will get figured out in terms of the tariffs perhaps going down or whatever. But the disruption in the market, when they're like, wow, I got to go sell some of this right now. Some of those kinds of pressures and making them unpredictable as to what they're going to do with like the crop that is here this year. They can't reverse those decisions that they made, you know, 10 months ago or even more than a year ago about how much money they laid out and everything. And so there are tensions and cross currents out there that I think are going to push on the system a little more here as we get through the shutdown, we still have a lot of things to face as a country. And, we haven't had a farm bill in a long time. And, so I just think that some of those pressures and some of the things that are happening, there's going to be more pushback. I just think it may come from some places that we aren't thinking about when we have the discussion about those individual leaders. I agree that I've never worked for a governor, so I'm going to put that on my list. I should work for a governor at some point. I've not done that, but I feel as though I work for people in Congress who were those people and wanting to get stuff done. But in the same breath, these governors do have a lot of say over what can happen in their states, but I think this whole piece around the federal government, like at what point do governors across party in a bipartisan fashion stand up and say, we can't have it like this on XYZ in our states, it's not working. And I think if we saw some of those types of things happen, that has a potential to shake some of this loose. But honestly, for the people out there, seeing more of their leaders stand up in those ways that aren't the traditional ways, or frankly, I wrote down, what are leaders doing? I was like, well, a number of them are hunkered down right now. And I would offer, I feel like that's more on the Republican side than the Democratic side, but I would offer that I feel that way about the Democrats too, that too many people are just hunkered down right now and not fighting back and standing in the place of leadership that they're supposed to.
All right. So we would like to, with that, open the floor to your questions, if you have them. And you feel free to range wherever you like to range on the prairie with your questions. We'd be happy to come. Yes, Madam Hostess.
Institutions under stress. We talk a lot about Congress, and then the states having to feel. Yeah, take the mic. We talked about institutions under stress, and that's what this panel is about. I wondered what you, and I know none of you might be actually experts in this, but we haven't talked about the courts, the judiciary.
Yep.
We talked a lot about executive and legislative. I'd just like to get your thoughts, if we have a clear view of what's going on with the stress tests on the courts, and where do you see some of?
Yeah, and I would also add to that. I was going to go there till I saw the yellow card. So, but I love it. But I think that's another important feature of the stress test. What we see playing out in our judicial system, and the constitutional stresses that the country has had to deal with over the last few months, several months, and your thoughts there.
I have a tiny governor's plug on the courts. I'm sorry to say this.
We're very on brand.
Exactly. Like, we're reliable messengers. Okay. I started this thing in the DGA called Power to Appoint when everyone understandably started being really nervous about like Trump politicizing the federal courts, that it's just an education campaign about the role governors play in our court system. So I'm going to hit you with some stats really quick. 48 out of 50 governors can make judicial appointments. Half of all governors appoint in their state Supreme Courts. More than 20% of Trump's judicial appointments during his first term were originally appointed by Republican governors. So we're also talking about a judicial appointment pipeline for future federal judges. And there are more governor-issued judicial appointments than every federal appointment combined. Like in New Jersey, which is the constitutionally most powerful governor in the country, Phil Murphy's appointed like 300 judges. Governor Newsom has appointed like 600 judges. And like, it is just another example of like, if you're worried about the void of leadership in the federal government or what might be happening with a more increasingly politicized court system, you have to remember that there are like a ton of state levers that are controlling the court system right in your own backyard. I can give you all the stats if you want.
I agree, because Republican governors appoint too. So
Yes.
we are on the same page on this one.
Yes.
I always think it's funny. No one cares who their governor is unless they live in that state or have business in that state. And it doesn't make any sense to me. Just because there's no magical, like the 26th governor gets the vote on who the leader governor is around the country, like they have in the Senate and the House. We just don't get the same attention as the House and the Senate do, but they are just as powerful. I was hoping that COVID would kind of show that to the American people a little bit more, but it still hasn't. I mean, to an extent it has, but I mean, Meghan and I have talked about this. We agree completely. Like, governors are where it's at. It's the future of the country. And so you'll see us sparring over this stuff and whether we think it should be a Republican governor or a Democrat governor. But I think we're in definite agreement that governors do hold a lot of power and don't get quite the respect that they deserve on the national stage.
I would agree. I would agree.
Hi, my name's Katie, and I'm from Missouri for context. But I'm studying politics and economics here at Oxford, and so I wanted to branch off of your point is that people aren't engaged in state politics in the same way they are in federal politics. And is that an issue, or is that changing?
I think it's a little bit of an issue. I mean, it is to the point. I mean, when you get 51 senators, you have a majority and then a governing majority. And so I like to say we have the majority of governors in the country. Meghan likes to say that you
Govern the
majority of the American population. So we can both like have our own little wins here on how we talk about it. But there's no like actual vote of, okay, all 50 governors get together and sit in a room and they get to decide that, you know, Brian Kemp is the leader of the governors. And so that's why we don't get the kind of attention that the House and the Senate get.
Just a point of clarification, we have at the table the Democratic, Governors Association, the Republican Governors Association, but we do also have a National Governors Association in which a Democrat and Republican typically share, or how does that work? I mean, because
I think Sara and I should join and lead it together and perform it, but
Yeah, maybe thoughts on that.
But you do have my point is you do have a space where the governors of the respective parties do come together.
But there's no,
They don't make, that's not the point about making laws, but the point is having that laboratory where they learn or talk to each other. Now, if the National Governors Association is a waste of time, which is probably what you're both saying, without saying it, that's a different question. But my point is there is this space in which Republican and Democratic governors do come together. And we even have a Lieutenant Governors Association where Republican and Democratic lieutenant governors come together, and we just talk about how many times we have to, refer to our Bible just in case the governor's ill that day, and we're ready to go to assume the role of governor. But you do have that. To your point, there are these mechanisms in which that feeder for information and citizen engagement can be realized through the work that these governors are doing.
Really quick. I think to your question, we've seen it change a lot in the Democratic Party side for the last decade or so, where there's now much more attention and funding and stuff focused on governors' races, but we are still dwarfed by what happens with the U.S. Senate and Congress. More money was spent on the Montana Senate race last year than is in my entire budget for 2026, where we have 36 governors' races. Roy Cooper, former governor of North Carolina, just announced for Senate, raised $14 million in the first 3 months of his race. That's what our total budget was for both of his governor's races. There is so much more attention and funding on federal races, to Sara's point, because it's much more straightforward to see, you need the majority, that's the only goal. That's why at the DGA, I think one of the things that's made us successful the last 10 years is we're finding ways to connect why the governor of Minnesota matters to you if you live in California. It's because he has strong judicial appointment power. He has strong redistricting oversight. Actually, if you care about a fundamentally realigned congressional majority, you need to elect Democratic governors in these 7 states. We've been able to, I think, connect the dots for people in a bigger way, which I think is why we're slowly turning the curve to the states.
I might throw in there too, while we are focused federal and state, I think one thing that we've seen, especially in the public affairs space in the US, is a lot of reinvigorated local issue advocacy, very grassroots oriented. Some of that is driven by it's easier to get your message out now vis-a-vis social media and social media organizing and whatnot. But I think a lot of people, both federally, nationally, locally, and corporate America are kind of waking up to, hey, there's actually a very vibrant issue advocacy network locally and in these states. And when we're thinking about how do we engage for a new investment, maybe in a county or building a data center, for example, in the US right now, like you're not paying it, you have probably the governor on your side, you have the president on your side, but man, you need 15 out of 0 city council member votes on your side. And that's because there's a lot of issue advocacy, reinvigoration at the grassroots level. And we shouldn't discount that. And I think 20 years from now, that's where we're seeing some of these leaders come from and so forth. A lot of it's genuine, some of it's astroturfed out there and so forth, but it is very real for a lot of different players than we've been talking about.
All right. Next question.
Thank you. You all talk a lot about like, right. I'm Ruhan. I'm a first year from NYU. So yeah, I'm tending towards economics for now. All right. So you've spoken a lot about how like there's this pendulum that's swinging in the sense like this metaphor of like the nation being stretched and this pendulum just getting stretched further and further. And there's like a lot of tension building up on the string. But how do we know, where do we put our foot down? How do I know that, okay, and take a stand saying that, hey, this is the limit and we cannot move further than that? Because you talk a lot about like this blueprint and the state having a lot of power. Agreed, that's the idea of the United States in a nutshell. That's what's called the United States. But like, for example, a good example is Martin Luther, 1960s. Good example is Martin Luther, 1990s, saying that, okay, this is the ultimatum, okay, we cannot cross beyond this point. How much power does the state have to actually do that today, given that we have a person in office that's like the get shit done leader who will do anything to get shit done? So, yeah.
When the pendulum hits you in the head.
Anybody?
Is part of your question about where is the limit or where will people stand up to help create one? Is that the gist of it? Look, I can become a professor next. I guess I have an option. Don't have to go work for a governor. Professor. Well, you know, I think right now, I think it's hard to say where that is. And I think that's part of the concern. I kind of brought up farmers because I think, you know, that piece for them is their economic livelihood. And there are already less farmers than there have been in the past. And we're on a trajectory over the next 20 years or so to see much more consolidation in the US of our rural communities and our farming, individuals farming. And so, you know, I think that's a place because that also cross-cuts the country in a different way and it cross-cuts politics in a different way. So I see some potential there from rural America, from farmers in particular. And, you know, obviously I'm more connected to Iowa in that idea, but, you know, the farming communities cut really a broad geographic swath across the country. And I think that's a space where I could see folks kind of standing up in a different way. I also think sometimes with folks, it's like, you know, I think people find themselves in what I call conundrums. And years ago, I remember I lived on Capitol Hill, and over the course of one weekend, there was an immigration reform rally, and those groups and individuals were on the mall and everywhere around marching. And then the next day was Tea Party. And I remember watching the news that night, and it was CNN, and this woman who was of the age of perhaps hitting towards Medicare. And so the interviewer was like, you know, she's like, I want less government, and that's what I'm here for. And I came from, I'm not sure where, I'm going to say Missouri, because that was the first questioner. She came from Missouri. And the questioner goes, oh, okay, well, but it looks like you might be kind of in that range where you're going to be thinking about Social Security and Medicare retirement and stuff. And well, how does that, you know, fit with this piece that you're saying you want a lot of less government? And she looks directly in the camera and she goes, well, that's a conundrum. right? And so I think there are a lot of people who feel as though they're in a conundrum right now.
But
And I think some of those farmers who voted for Trump, who now are like not having good mornings at the breakfast table, worrying and looking at the prices and wondering how they're going to find a market, they're in a conundrum. And so who's going to be in the most intense conundrum to shake something loose in a different way than we've seen? You know, I see lots of energy around our members and supporters, but that's because we've been under attack for a while. And so, you know, that's natural. But I think some of these folks who were expecting something different or not expecting certain things to go too far, I think that's where this is going to kind of bubble up in some way. I obviously hope sooner rather than later.
I'll throw in there too, like there are still fundamental truths that matter, and we've seen them in this last week and so forth. Elections matter. The candidates that the RGA, the DGA put forward, they matter. Their message matters at the end of the day. They're in the courtroom too. They got to convince people that they have the right policy solutions and not. Are they a strong candidate? Do they have a strong campaign? All those are fundamental truths, and all those are fundamental checks. You know, I'm from Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, big towns or small town, big name. At the end of the day, every Saturday there is a No Kings protest in Little Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, about 8,000 people and so forth. Very activated. Gettysburg College is in there. The borough itself is probably 90% Dem. It is in a 90% Trump county at the end of the day. So the fundamental truth is those people who are protesting also now have to organize behind campaigns and candidates with messages that can convince other people on the fundamental issues of the day. And the ultimate check here is probably going to be 2026. And both parties are in a race now towards 2026. So we can get wrapped up in the controversy, but at the end of the day, it is going to be a candidate versus another candidate, and who can convince who that actually has a policy solution. So my old job was oppo research in politics, and I would tell people 100% negative campaigns don't win elections, 100% positive campaigns don't win elections. Contrast messages win elections of why my candidate is better than the other candidate. And both parties have the job to do to convince people in 2026. And that's the ultimate check. And then 2028, ultimate check.
All right. Any others? Over here?
Thank you. Based on kind of Lynn's earlier question and something that you mentioned, Sara. Congress has abandoned mostly its control function in the federal government. So you mentioned kind of governors and AGs with their lawsuits filling the void. But do you not see any kind of inherent risks to that? Because it makes state elections very much secondary elections, referenda on national politics. Does that not kind of then replicate the fault lines on a state level and kind of introduces the same dysfunctionality on a state level as you see on the national level, and also further politicizes the judiciary, kind of trapping states in a similar kind of doom loop as it is the case on the federal level at the moment?
I mean, that's a very doom approach. I'm probably a little more optimistic than that on the American people. I don't know. I mean, I think at the end of the day, midterm elections are always going to be somewhat set by the national environment. It doesn't really matter too much. We can tinker around the edges, but at some point, midterms are always indicative of, you know, the party that has power in the White House tends to not do as well in the midterm election as they would like to. And so I don't know that necessarily, I'm not too worried about the electoral consequences of it. But, you know, I think the state elected leaders are so much closer to their people too. I mean, I think they live in the governor's residence. There's a governor's residence that these guys have to live in, and they're seen on nightly news. You don't see them on MSNBC or MS Now, sorry. You don't see them on CNN very often. I know you would like to see them, but a lot of them, you're not going to see a lot of the governors on these national news programs because, but if you go to the state and turn on the local news, you're going to see them all over the place because they're a little bit more connected to the people that they serve on a regular basis. So I think that there's just that little piece so it doesn't quite worry me, I think, to the extent that you had laid out, but there's always concern there.
While we get to the next question, I have a point of personal privilege for this young man. You were the one who gave me the right directions to get here today. Yeah. I went to a wrong direction and then my phone was catching up with itself. And he literally said, I said, now I need to get to Rhodes Hall. And he goes, it's 10 minutes that way. And he goes, then he stops and goes, you're for the American politics thing. You'll get there in time for the first panel. So thank you for that.
Any other questions? Yes, right here. Oh, we're over here. Oh, sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thanks. My name's Frances. I'm from New York. And so, we've talked about sort of the breakdown of institutions, be that public or sort of private or just all of the above, on the one hand. And then you've also sort of talked about the role of public sector leaders and sort of governors, senators, Congress, whatever, the president. So I'm sort of curious, in a gilded era age, we've talked about sort of the rise of big tech and sort of big corporations. What is or should be the role of private or sort of corporate leadership in all of this and sort of preventing some of the breakdown or institutions or sort of a relationship between these public leaders you've talked about and the private sector?
All right.
Well, I would say probably when it comes to corporate America, it's been quite the seesaw over the last 4 or 5 years and so forth from I think 2000 or 2020 to today and so forth. I think what you've seen is a lot more of them take the viewpoint of, hey, we've got our companies, we're managing our companies, we're building our companies and so forth. We interact with government where we have to interact with government. We will represent our employees or so forth, but there's also been backlash to activism and whatnot. So I think there's been more of a refocus at the end of the day. And I think a lot of them have taken the position of let's be representative of our employees and our business and so forth. And I think that's the role that they've decided to take. And you can argue whether that's good or bad and so forth, but you've seen them, I think, kind of say, we do not want to play monkey in the middle to both sides, because both sides will do that to them. You stand up too high, you get knocked down by the right. You don't stand up, you get knocked down by the left at the end of the day. So a lot of them have taken the position that, hey, we will interact with government where we have to interact. And there are big issues that they have to interact with government on. And it would be the same with Biden or with Trump at the end of the day. So, I think a lot of them have, let's refocus on our companies and let's refocus on managing political risk as opposed to engaging in the political system. But I would say to both probably the RGA and DGA have experienced, they're still actively involved because government at all levels have immense implications on them and so forth. So they're not seated the ground, seated leadership. They're actively involved in ensuring that the environment that government sets is conducive to business growing and so forth. So they're actively engaged, but I don't think you're going to see activism at a high level going forward.
Last question. Yes. Thank you for moving on this spot.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate historian here. Thank you for what's been a really interesting discussion. I wanted to get your thoughts on institutions and political violence, particularly, I think you've already touched on it a bit, but how disillusionment with institutions maybe is fueling violence, but also how threats of violence are shaping how institutions are functioning. I'm thinking particularly, it's not just presidential candidates who are under threat, but we've seen state lawmakers, governors, people maybe at those more localized levels face violence as well.
I mean, that's particularly important at the governor's level. As you mentioned, we have 2 governors threatened directly in the last 5 or 6 years. You had state elected officials lose their lives even federal officials, even going back to the shooting of members of Congress at a baseball game. So you've got this arc of violence that has emerged in the body politic. How do we? What does that say? How is that addressed at the various levels that we've been talking about?
Oh, I think some of it is, I mean, stuff like this matters. I mean, the most heartbreaking thing about Charlie Kirk getting murdered was he was doing it by just talking to people. And that's what we need to talk to more people. I saw an interview with some celebrity in the States last week that said, you know, I have a really hard time. I won't talk to any of my family. What? Was it? Or no, not a different one. It was, Jennifer Lawrence said that she's not going to talk about politics anymore, but someone else said, I have a hard time talking to anyone who voted for Donald Trump. They're just, I can't do it. I'm not going to talk to him anymore. I'm losing relationships with my family over it. And I just think that's such the wrong position to take. I mean, like, Meghan and I compete against each other every single day. It is my literal job to do better than her, and her literal job is to do better than me. But you're not going to see us not share a drink after this and have a conversation. And I think that kind of stuff in politics in America needs to come back. We can't just go to our corners and just say, okay, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. And I think we're just in such a polarized environment. Like, JoDee and I aren't going to agree on everything, but she's a great Iowan and I love her. And we're going to continue to have these conversations. And so I think that's the part of politics that worries me the most, is when we can't sit down and have these conversations. We're not going to agree on everything. There's no way. We never could. If you're going to agree with 100% of what a politician does or says, then you're the actual politician yourself, because there's no way you can agree with 100% of what someone does, or I'd be shocked if you did. So anyway, that's kind of my take on it. It's just, we need to continue to engage in dialogue. That's why things like this are really super important. I'm so appreciative that everyone comes out and does these kinds of things, because it really is refreshing to get to talk to Democrats that I don't get to see every day. And hopefully they don't not enjoy talking to me as well.
I think we should make that.
Oh, there you go.
Very good. Thank you all very much.